Imagine waking up in the early 1500s, long before central heating, weather forecasts, or electric light. Outside, the world is silent. Snow has fallen through the night, thick and heavy, covering rooftops, fields, and narrow dirt roads. There are no engines, no distant traffic sounds, only the muted stillness that snow brings. In the 16th century, snowfall was not a picturesque moment meant for leisure or photography. It was a serious event that shaped daily life, survival, and routine. Winter was not something to admire from behind a window. It was something to endure. Snowfall often began in late autumn and could last well into early spring. Once it arrived, it changed everything. Houses in the 1500s were built to resist cold, but not comfortably. Thick stone walls helped retain some warmth, yet they also absorbed cold during long winters. Wooden homes creaked as temperatures dropped. Snow piled up against walls, sometimes reaching window height, blocking light and fresh air. Inside, fires burned constantly. Hearths were rarely allowed to go out. A family would carefully ration firewood, knowing that running out in midwinter could be dangerous. Snow meant more fuel was needed, but collecting would become harder as forests were buried and paths disappeared. For farmers, snowfall was both a threat and a necessity. Heavy snow could destroy poorly stored crops or collapse barns, but it also protected the soil beneath, insulating winter grains from extreme frost. Still, daily farm work slowed dramatically. Animals were kept indoors for weeks at a time, fed with hay stored since summer. Travel during snowfall was slow and uncertain. Roads were unpaved, often little more than muddy tracks. When snow fell, wagons became useless. Horses struggled. People traveled on foot when necessary, wrapping themselves in wool, leather, and layered clothing that grew heavy as it absorbed moisture. Messages that normally took days could take weeks. Villages became isolated. News traveled slowly, if at all. Snowstorms could completely cut off a community, forcing families to rely only on what they had stored. In cities, snowfall created different challenges. Streets narrowed as snow piled up along walls. Waste disposal became difficult, making winter months particularly unsanitary. Frozen water sources meant long walks to wells that still functioned. Ice had to be broken daily. Yet life did not stop. Markets continued in smaller forms. Bakers worked through the night so bread would be ready before dawn. Snow did not excuse hunger. People queued quietly in the cold, breath visible in the air, hands numb beneath gloves made of wool or fur. Children experienced winter differently. Snow brought brief moments of joy. Simple games, footprints in untouched streets, laughter echoing between buildings. But these moments were short. Cold was dangerous, especially for the young and elderly. Church bells often sounded more frequently in winter. Illness spread easily in cold, damp homes. Snowfall, while beautiful, was closely associated with hardship, sickness, and loss. At night, darkness came early. With snow outside reflecting moonlight faintly, interiors were lit by candles and oil lamps. Shadows danced on walls. The wind pressed against shutters. Snow tapped softly against wooden frames. People slept fully clothed, sometimes several to a bed, sharing warmth. Silence dominated winter nights, broken only by the crackle of fire or the distant howl of wind across frozen fields. Snowfall in the 1500s was not an interruption of life. It was life for months at a time. Each morning began with clearing snow from doorways, feeding animals, checking roofs, and ensuring the fire still burned. These routines repeated day after day, week after week, until spring slowly returned. When the snow finally melted, it left behind soaked earth, damaged roads, and exhausted people, but also relief. Survival through winter was an achievement. In the 1500s, snow was not something to escape. It was something to live with, respect, and endure quietly. And as snow fell again the following year, life adjusted once more, slowly, patiently, and without complaint. As winter deepened in the 1500s, snowfall became less of an event and more of a constant presence. Days blended into one another beneath a pale sky that rarely cleared. Snow no longer felt new. It became part of the landscape, shaping every movement and decision. Morning routines began slowly. People woke before sunrise, not because of clocks, but because the cold made sleep shallow. Breath appeared in the air even indoors. Before anything else, someone checked the fire. Embers were carefully stirred, hoping a flame could be coaxed back to life. If the fire had gone out during the night, the day began with difficulty. Outside, snow muffled sound. Footsteps were dull and slow. The world felt smaller. Distances that once seemed short now required effort and planning. A walk to a nearby field or well could take twice as long, especially when paths were hidden beneath drifts. Snow also changed time itself. Work was measured less by hours and more by daylight. When clouds hung low and snow continued to fall, the day felt shorter, even if it was not. Tasks were fewer, slower, and repetitive. Repairing tools, mending clothes, shelling grain, and preparing food filled long indoor hours. In rural areas, families relied heavily on what they had preserved months earlier. Snowfall was a reminder of past preparation. Those who had salted meat, dried beans, stored root vegetables, and stacked firewood felt cautious relief. Those who had not felt quiet anxiety grow with every storm. Animals sensed winter too. Chickens stopped laying eggs regularly. Sheep huddled together. Horses grew restless indoors. Farmers checked them often, knowing that sickness during winter could mean starvation later. Snowstorms were especially feared. When snow fell thickly for days without pause, roofs became heavy. Men climbed carefully to remove snow, risking falls on icy tiles. A collapsed roof could destroy stored food, tools, and shelter in a single moment. In towns and cities, snow created narrow corridors between buildings. People walked close to walls to avoid slipping. Snow mixed with ash and waste, turning white streets gray. Yet even here, life continued quietly. Apprentices swept shop entrances. Merchants opened shutters slowly, letting cold air spill inside. Snowfall also affected sound and communication. Bells carried farther in cold air. Church bells marked time, prayer, and warning. In heavy snow, their echo felt distant and lonely. Letters written in winter were shorter. Ink thickened in cold rooms. Fingers stiffened quickly. Words were chosen carefully, written slowly, then folded and sealed, knowing delivery might take weeks. Even celebrations changed under snow. Winter feasts were quieter affairs. Candles burned longer into the night. Conversations were softer. Music, if played, stayed indoors. Snow outside pressed the world inward, turning attention to small spaces and close company. As weeks passed, people learned to read the snow. Fresh snowfall meant silence. Older snow meant danger. Ice beneath, hidden obstacles, weakened structures. Footprints told stories. Who had passed, how recently, and where they went. Nightfall arrived early and decisively. Once darkness came, little reason existed to stay awake. Fuel was precious. Candles were limited. Snow reflected faint moonlight, but inside, shadows dominated. Sleep came early, though not always easily. Cold crept into blankets. Wind found its way through cracks. Snow piled against doors and windows, pressing gently but persistently. Yet there was also a strange calm in these nights. No expectations. No urgency beyond survival. The world slowed under snow, forcing patience. Winter in the 1500s did not rush. Each snowfall added another layer, not just on the ground, but on memory. People remembered harsh winters for years, measuring time by storms survived and springs awaited. And when snow finally began to soften, when dripping sounds replaced silence, people noticed immediately. The first melt was subtle. Water ran beneath snow, unseen. Paths reappeared slowly. Life did not return all at once. It seeped back in. Until then, snow remained, covering fields, quieting voices, stretching time. And in the 1500s, people lived within it, day after day, without complaint, without escape, and without knowing exactly when it would end. As winter stretched on, snow became a measure of endurance rather than weather. People no longer spoke of when it started. They spoke of how long it had stayed. Days were counted not by dates, but by storms, thaws, and freezes. Snow changed the color of everything. Fields lost their boundaries. Roads vanished into white emptiness. Familiar landmarks faded. A tree, a fence, a stone wall, each became a point of reference in an otherwise endless landscape. Daily movement required caution. A misstep could mean injury, and injury in winter was dangerous. Broken bones, infections, and untreated wounds often worsened in the cold. Snow slowed not only travel, but recovery. Inside homes, air grew thick with smoke. Chimneys did not always draw properly in heavy snowfall. Windows stayed shut. Snow blocked drafts, but also blocked freshness. People lived close together, sharing warmth, smells, and silence. Silence was everywhere. Snow absorbed sound so completely that even villages felt empty. Voices carried less. Animals were quieter. Tools struck more softly. This silence shaped thought. Long pauses filled conversations. Words were chosen slowly. Children learned patience early. Playtime was brief and supervised. Wet clothes were dangerous. Frostbitten fingers were a real fear. Games ended quickly, followed by warming hands near the fire. Snow also influenced belief. Many saw long winters as tests of faith. Prayers for mercy, early spring, and survival filled churches. Candles flickered beneath stone ceilings while snow fell silently outside. Stories told in winter were slower too. Elders spoke of past winters, comparing snowfall, hunger, and loss. These stories were not dramatic. They were steady, factual, almost calm. Survival itself had taught restraint. Food was eaten carefully. Portions were measured. No one knew how long winter would last. Snow outside meant uncertainty inside. Even wealthier households practiced moderation, aware that supply lines were fragile. In some regions, rivers froze solid. Snow fed the ice, thickening it day by day. Crossing frozen rivers became possible, but dangerous. Ice was trusted only when tested repeatedly. Snowfall also reshaped labor. Outdoor work nearly stopped. Winter became a season of maintenance. Tools were sharpened. Nets were repaired. Clothing was patched and repatched. Nothing was wasted. Snow piled high against doors, forcing people to dig their way out each morning. This simple act became ritual. Shoveling snow was the first task of the day, repeated endlessly, without complaint. At night, snow reflected moonlight faintly across rooftops. The sky felt lower. Clouds pressed down. Stars disappeared for weeks. People slept without knowing what the sky looked like. Dreams, perhaps, grew longer. Snowstorms came without warning. Winds howled. Snow drove sideways. Visibility vanished. During such storms, people stayed inside, listening. The storm was not fought. It was waited out. Waiting was a skill learned early. Winter taught patience better than any lesson. Snow made people slow, careful, observant. It removed urgency. Nothing could be rushed. When sickness came, snow made it harder to seek help. Healers traveled less. Remedies were limited. Many illnesses simply had to pass, or not. Snowfall did not care. And yet, life persisted quietly. Babies were born in winter. Bread was baked. Fires were tended. Snow did not stop time, it stretched it. Eventually, subtle changes appeared. Snow crusted instead of fluffing. Footprints lasted longer. The air smelled different. These signs were noticed immediately, even if spoken of cautiously. Hope returned slowly. But until then, snow remained the defining presence of the 1500s winter. Not dramatic. Not gentle. Simply constant. Covering mistakes. Covering paths. Covering the past. And under that snow, people lived. calmly, steadily, waiting for a season they could not control. As the winter of the 1500s moved toward its deepest point, snowfall no longer surprised anyone. It arrived quietly, often at night, layering itself over what had already fallen. The ground rose slowly, season by season, storm by storm. People became skilled at noticing small changes. The sound of snow underfoot told them its age. Fresh snow whispered softly. Older snow cracked. Ice hidden beneath revealed itself through a subtle shift in step. Morning light, when it came, was pale and brief. Snow reflected what little brightness there was, but clouds often swallowed it quickly. Shadows were faint. Colors disappeared. The world felt drained of contrast. Work indoors filled the long hours. Hands moved automatically, guided by habit rather than urgency. Wool was spun. Needles passed through cloth again and again. Knots were tied. Everything was repaired because nothing could be replaced easily. Snow made time feel circular. Each day followed the same pattern. Wake. Feed the fire. Eat something warm if possible. Tend to animals. Clear snow. Return inside. Repeat. Conversation slowed. Silence became comfortable. Words were saved for necessity. Long pauses were normal. Snow encouraged listening rather than speaking. In some homes, people slept in shifts to keep the fire alive. Someone always remained half awake, ready to tend embers. Letting the fire die could mean starting over in freezing darkness. Snow pressing against walls insulated houses slightly, but also trapped dampness. Wooden beams swelled. Stone grew colder. Clothing never fully dried. Cold lingered everywhere. Outside, snow reshaped familiar spaces. Fields lost their identity. Boundaries vanished. The land became one continuous surface, broken only by trees and buildings. Travelers, when they appeared, were rare and noticeable. A stranger in winter brought news and concern. Hospitality was expected, but resources were limited. Each visitor meant sharing food and warmth. Snow also altered sound at night. Even animals were quieter. Wolves, when present, moved silently across snowfields. Their tracks were often the only sign of life beyond the village. Fear existed, but it was subdued. Winter fear was not panic, it was awareness. People understood the risks and lived within them. Children learned early that snow was not a toy. It was cold, heavy, and unforgiving. Yet they also learned how to move within it, how to wrap themselves properly, how to return indoors before numbness set in. Churches offered warmth and routine. Snow did not stop gatherings unless storms were severe. Bells rang through falling snow, marking time even when days felt endless. Food tasted different in winter. Salted meat, dried grains, and simple bread formed the core of meals. Warmth mattered more than flavor. A hot bowl meant survival. As weeks passed, people spoke quietly of spring, though never confidently. Snow taught restraint and hope. Too many winters had returned unexpectedly. At night, snow continued falling long after people slept. It covered footprints, erased paths, and softened edges. By morning, yesterday felt distant. Snow was memory made physical. And in the 1500s, winter was not fought. It was lived through, slowly, quietly, one snowfall at a time. As winter held its ground, snow became part of the body's memory. People no longer reacted to the cold consciously. Movements adjusted on their own. Shoulders hunched. Steps shortened. Hands stayed close to warmth. Snow shaped patience. Nothing happened quickly anymore. Even simple tasks took time. A door frozen shut required waiting. A frozen well required careful effort. Rushing only made things worse. Inside homes, the air was still. Snow blocked wind, but also sealed houses from the outside world. Smoke lingered near ceilings. Light flickered gently. Everything felt enclosed. People spent more time listening. To the fire, to the wind, to the soft sound of snow sliding from roofs. These sounds became familiar companions. In the 1500s, snowfall was rarely described as beautiful. It was described as heavy, long, or difficult. Beauty was not the priority. Endurance was. Snow also erased urgency. There was nowhere to go. Nothing to chase. Winter removed choice and replaced it with routine. Even emotions flattened under snow. Joy was quieter. Worry was steady, not sharp. Everything moved toward balance. Some nights, snow fell without wind. Those nights were the quietest. No creaking branches. No drifting sounds. Just stillness. People slept deeper on those nights, wrapped tightly, trusting the fire to last until morning. In the distance, forests stood silent under snow-laden branches. Paths through them vanished. The woods became places to avoid until thaw. Snow taught respect for limits. People learned how far they could walk, how long they could stay outside, how much strength they had. Illness, when it came, moved slowly too. Coughs lingered. Fevers rose gently. Care was simple and patient. Snowfall continued to arrive without announcement. It did not mark beginnings or endings. It simply continued. And so did life. Quietly. Carefully. Without resistance. As the season lingered, snow became something people carried with them even indoors. Cold settled into bones. Fingers moved stiffly. Warmth was temporary and precious. People learned to conserve energy. Movements were economical. No step was wasted. Snow made even standing still feel deliberate. Inside, daily life followed a narrow rhythm. Meals were simple and repetitive. The same ingredients appeared again and again. Familiarity brought comfort. Predictability felt safe. Snow outside softened the world, but inside, edges remained sharp. Hunger was real. Cold was real. Yet panic rarely surfaced. Winter had always been this way. Snow reshaped memory. People remembered winters more clearly than summers. They remembered which year the snow was deepest, which winter lasted longest, which storm was hardest to endure. Stories told during winter were slower and quieter. They did not entertain so much as accompany the night. Words filled silence gently. Windows stayed small and dim. Snow reflected faint light, but days remained short. People relied on touch more than sight. They knew objects by memory, not by looking. Snow altered smell as well. The outside air was clean and sharp. Indoors, smoke, wool, and stored food blended into a familiar scent of winter. Snowfall marked separation. The world beyond the village felt distant and unreachable. Travel plans were postponed indefinitely. Life narrowed inward. And yet, people adapted fully. There was no sense of waiting for rescue or relief. Snow was expected. Winter was accepted. Children grew under snow. Elders aged beneath it. Life did not pause, it simply slowed. When storms passed, the aftermath was quiet inspection. Roofs checked. Paths cleared. Fires strengthened. No celebration, just continuation. Snow did not bring drama every day. Most days were ordinary. That ordinariness was winter's true weight. Night after night, snow fell or rested. Morning after morning, people rose and continued. In the 1500s, snow was not scenery. It was condition. It was context. It was time itself. And beneath it, life moved forward. Quietly, steadily, without expectation of ease. As winter wore on, snow stopped feeling temporary. It became the normal state of the world. People no longer imagined bare ground. They imagined more snow. The body adapted. Cold no longer shocked, it pressed gently, constantly. Hands learned how close they needed to stay to the fire. Feet learned how long they could endure snow before numbness set in. Snowfall blurred the line between days. One morning looked much like the next. The same white outside. The same dim light. The same quiet. Inside, people moved carefully around each other. Space was shared. Privacy was rare. Snow kept everyone close, physically and emotionally, though not always in conversation. Silence became a form of rest. Snow also slowed thought. Decisions were simple. eat, warm, sleep, maintain. Winter reduced life to essentials. People listened closely to weather signs. A shift in wind, a change in snow texture. These small signals mattered. They determined whether it was safe to step outside or better to stay in. Snow covered mistakes. Broken paths disappeared. Old tracks vanished overnight. Each snowfall erased yesterday. This erasing was oddly comforting. At night, snow reflected what little light the moon offered. Shadows softened. The world felt suspended. Dreams sometimes blended with the quiet outside. Snow entered sleep gently, without urgency. There were moments when snow stopped entirely. The silence afterward felt deep and complete. People noticed immediately, even if they said nothing. These pauses felt heavier than storms. And still, life continued. Fires burned. Food was prepared. Children slept. Elders watched quietly. Snow did not announce when it would leave. People learned not to ask. They lived within it. They adjusted to it. They endured it. And in the 1500s, that endurance was enough. As the heart of winter passed, snow began to settle rather than fall. It lay undisturbed for days at a time, hardened by cold nights and weak sunlight. The surface changed, becoming firm, almost glassy in places. Walking required attention. Every step was measured. People noticed how snow held the past in quiet ways. Old footprints, frozen solid, told stories of days before. A path taken once might remain visible for weeks, a faint reminder of movement in an otherwise still world. Inside homes, routines continued without variation. There was comfort in repetition. Hands knew what to do without instruction. The fire was fed. Food was warmed. Clothing was adjusted and readjusted. Snow made people aware of small comforts. Warmth on the face. Steam rising from a bowl. The sound of wood settling in the fire. These moments mattered more in winter. Outside, trees stood burdened with snow. Branches bent low. Some snapped under the weight, falling without warning. Their sound carried far in the quiet air, brief and startling, then gone. Snow also changed the rhythm of animals. Birds appeared rarely, conserving energy. Livestock moved little. Even dogs seemed quieter, curling close to warmth. In the 1500s, winter taught acceptance. There was no thought of escape. Snow was not an inconvenience, it was the season itself. People did not ask when it would end. They asked only whether they were prepared enough to continue. When the sun appeared, low and pale, it did little to warm the ground. Snow sparkled briefly, then returned to dull white. Light came and went without effect. Snow softened conflict. Harsh words felt out of place in the stillness. Voices lowered naturally. Winter encouraged calm, not because life was easier, but because resistance wasted energy. Night followed day without ceremony. Darkness arrived early. Candles were lit sparingly. The fire remained central. Snow outside pressed gently against walls and roofs, a constant presence rather than a threat. Life in the 1500s did not stop under snow. It narrowed, slowed, and focused. People lived closer to the moment. There was no room for distant plans. Only today mattered, and tomorrow would be faced when it arrived. And as snow remained, so did they, quietly enduring, quietly continuing, one unremarkable winter day at a time. As days shortened further, snow became less something to observe and more something to live inside. It shaped posture, breath, and habit. People no longer spoke about the cold. It was assumed like nightfall. Morning began without urgency. There was little reason to hurry when the world outside remained unchanged. Snow still covered the ground. The sky still hung low. Time moved quietly. Snow altered the sense of distance. A short walk felt long. A familiar place felt far away. The village itself felt smaller, contained within white borders that did not move. Indoors, sounds were softened. Even laughter felt muted. Snow outside absorbed echoes, leaving rooms filled with a gentle stillness. People learned to read each other's moods without words. Winter encouraged observation. Silence was not emptiness, it was shared understanding. Snow also brought a certain honesty. Needs were clear. There was no excess. No distraction. Life reduced itself naturally. Hands worked while minds rested. Simple tasks allowed thoughts to drift. Winter gave space for reflection, though not always intentionally. Some nights, snow fell so lightly it was barely noticed. Other nights it came steadily, patiently, covering what little change had occurred during the day. Morning always revealed the same result. More white, more quiet. In the forests, snow gathered thickly on branches. Paths disappeared completely. The woods became places of caution and respect. People did not wander far in winter. Snow marked boundaries. Between safe and unsafe, between inside and outside, between movement and rest. Children grew used to heavy clothing. Layers became second skin. The cold shaped memory from an early age. Food tasted warmer than it was. Warmth itself became a flavor. As winter continued, people trusted routine more than hope. They did not imagine spring vividly. They let it remain distant. Snow was steady. Winter was patient. Life followed. And so the days passed in the 1500s. Quiet, repetitive, enduring. Each snowfall another gentle reminder that survival was not dramatic, but constant. As winter settled into its final stretch, snow no longer felt heavy. It felt familiar. People moved through it without thinking, as if it had always been there. The white ground became the expected ground. Days began to feel slightly longer, though the cold did not loosen its grip. Light lingered just a little more in the afternoon. This change was noticed quietly. No one spoke of it aloud at first. Snow still covered everything, but its surface began to change. In places it hardened. In others, it softened during the day and froze again at night. Walking required attention once more, not because the snow was new, but because it was changing. Inside homes, winter routines continued unchanged. Fires were tended. Food was stretched carefully. Clothing was layered and relayered. Nothing felt different enough to act upon. Snow made people cautious with expectation. Too many winters had returned suddenly after seeming to fade. Hope was kept small and practical. Animals sensed the shift earlier than people. Restlessness appeared. Livestock moved more. Birds returned briefly, then vanished again. These signs were noted but not trusted. Snow still fell, though less often. When it did, it felt quieter, thinner, almost hesitant. It settled gently, adding to what was already there rather than reshaping the world. Even so, mornings remained cold. Breath still clouded the air. Hands still stiffened. Winter did not release its hold easily. People continued to live close to necessity. There was no sudden change in thought or behavior. Survival habits remained in place until they were no longer needed. Snow taught restraint until the very end. Only when water began to run beneath the snow, unseen but heard, did people allow themselves to notice. A faint drip from a roof. A soft sound underfoot. These signs carried more meaning than words. Still, no one rushed. In the 1500s, winter ended the same way it lived. Slowly, quietly, without announcement. Snow did not disappear all at once. It thinned. It retreated. It softened into water and mud and memory. And when bare ground finally returned, people did not celebrate loudly. They simply continued, adjusting once more, carrying the memory of snow with them into the seasons ahead. Winter had passed. Life remained. As winter loosened only slightly, snow remained everywhere, though it no longer felt as absolute as before. The ground beneath it began to shift. Ice cracked softly at dawn. Meltwater moved quietly under frozen layers, unseen but present. People noticed these changes without naming them. There was no announcement of transition. Winter simply adjusted its weight. Snow still covered fields, but its surface darkened in places. Footsteps pressed deeper. Paths became uncertain again, not because they were hidden, but because they changed daily. What was solid yesterday softened today, then froze again by night. Morning routines continued exactly as before. Fires were lit. Hands were warmed. Meals were eaten slowly. The body did not trust the season enough to relax. Snow lingered along walls and fences, retreating only where sunlight touched it briefly. Shadows mattered now. A roof edge that caught the sun thinned first. A stone wall facing south revealed bare patches, while the north remained white and silent. People noticed direction more carefully. Where the sun reached, life would return first. Still, cold nights erased daytime changes. Water froze again. Snow stiffened. Winter reminded everyone not to move too quickly. Inside homes, the air felt slightly different. Less sharp. Less heavy. Smoke lifted a little more easily. Doors opened without resistance more often. These small changes mattered deeply. Snowfall became rare but persistent. Light snow fell without urgency, almost gently, adding thin layers rather than depth. It no longer transformed the world, it maintained it. Animals reacted unevenly. Some grew restless, sensing change. Others remained cautious, remembering harsh nights too clearly. People remained careful with supplies. Winter had not taught optimism, it had taught discipline. No one celebrated early. Snow shaped memory in long winters. People remembered where it drifted highest, where it melted first, where it lingered longest. These details returned year after year. Children noticed the return of sound before adults did. Water dripping. Birds calling briefly. Wind moving differently through bare branches above snow. Still, play remained limited. Cold ground punished careless movement. Snow still demanded respect. Fields remained untouched. Farming waited. Tools stayed indoors. Winter had not released its hold on labor yet. Snow now carried the weight of months. It held dirt, ash, straw, and footprints frozen into its surface. White had faded into layered gray. Even so, snow continued to quiet the world. Sound did not fully return. Movement remained slow. Conversation stayed measured. At night, snow reflected moonlight unevenly now, broken by exposed ground and melting patches. The world felt less uniform, but not yet alive. People slept slightly lighter. The cold was less biting, but unpredictability replaced certainty. Winter was no longer steady, it was changing. Snow reminded people that endings could be slow and uneven. Some days felt like spring. Others returned to deep cold. Snow returned unexpectedly, covering exposed ground again, erasing progress without apology. No one complained. Winter had taught acceptance too well. Life adjusted daily. Clothing changed slightly. Doors stayed open a little longer. Fires burned slightly less fiercely, but never went out. Snow remained part of the day, even as it prepared to leave. Eventually, patches of earth appeared that did not disappear the next morning. Mud formed beneath snow, heavy and dark. Movement became messy rather than frozen. Snow melted into water, water into ground, ground into memory. People stepped carefully, not trusting either state. Cold water soaked boots. Nights still froze. The transition was uncomfortable. Snow had been predictable. Thaw was not. Paths became difficult again, not because of cold, but because of softness. Wagons sank. Feet slipped. Winter's final lesson was patience with disorder. Animals emerged cautiously. Farmers inspected land without touching it. Nothing was rushed. Snow retreated unevenly. Fields freed last. Roads first. Forests held snow longest. People noticed color returning slowly. Brown earth. Dark wood. Faded green beneath debris. Still, snow remained in sheltered places. Under trees. Along walls. In memory. When snow finally disappeared from daily thought, no one marked the moment. It passed unnoticed. Winter ended not with relief, but with adjustment. And when the next winter came, snow would be remembered, not romantically, not dramatically, but as it truly was in the 1500s. Constant, quiet, demanding. A season lived inside, not admired from afar. As the last traces of deep winter slowly loosened their grip, snow no longer dominated every thought, yet it still shaped every movement. It remained underfoot, along walls, beneath trees, and in shaded corners where the sun never reached. Winter had not left, it had simply become quieter. People moved through this time with caution. They had learned not to trust appearances. A brighter sky did not mean warmth. A softer surface did not mean safety. Snow taught skepticism better than any lesson. Mornings now began with listening. Not for storms, but for subtle sounds. Water dripping from eaves. Ice cracking gently beneath weight. These sounds suggested change, but never certainty. Snow had layered the land with memory. Under it lay months of footsteps, fallen branches, and forgotten tools. As it melted, these objects returned slowly, altered by time and cold. Inside homes, routines shifted almost imperceptibly. Fires were still necessary, but they burned lower. Windows were opened briefly, then closed again. Fresh air entered, unfamiliar after so long. The smell of winter changed. Smoke still lingered, but damp earth began to mix with it. Wool and leather absorbed moisture again. Clothing felt heavier, not from cold, but from thaw. Snow revealed unevenness in the world. Where it had hidden flaws, melting exposed them. Roads became difficult. Yards turned to mud. Walking required new care. Winter's end was not gentle. Snow had been firm and predictable. Thaw was slow and uncomfortable. Cold water soaked into boots. Feet chilled more than before. People missed the certainty of frozen ground. Snow, in its final days, clung stubbornly to places that had never seen warmth. Under hedges, behind buildings, along stone foundations. It resisted disappearance. People did not rush spring. They had learned restraint. Seeds remained stored. Tools stayed inside. Hope was kept practical. Children noticed the change first in sound. Birds returned briefly. Insects stirred once, then vanished again. Nature tested itself carefully. Snow continued to fall occasionally, light and brief, as if uncertain of its role. It settled thinly, then vanished within days. These small returns felt familiar, not alarming. Nighttime felt different now. Darkness remained, but the air softened. Cold no longer cut sharply. Sleep came more easily, though unpredictability replaced stillness. Snow no longer defined the day, but it still framed it. People looked outward more often. Doors opened longer. Conversations drifted outside briefly, then returned indoors. The world expanded slowly. Snow, once all-consuming, became background. Yet no one forgot it. Long winters stayed in memory, long after they ended. They shaped expectations, habits, and stories told years later. Snow was remembered not for its beauty, but for its persistence. In the 1500s, winter was not survived dramatically. It was endured quietly, patiently, and without spectacle. Snow did not teach heroism. It taught steadiness. And when life fully returned, when fields dried, paths cleared and work resumed, people carried winter with them, folded into memory like a heavy garment set aside, knowing it would be needed again. Because snow always returned. Not as surprise. Not as novelty. But as certainty. And so it had been. And so it would be. As the land continued to release winter slowly, traces of snow suggested where the cold had lingered longest. In shaded corners, beneath old trees, and beside stone walls, thin layers remained. These final patches felt older than the rest of the world, as if they belonged to a previous time. People walked past them without comment. Snow no longer demanded attention, but it still commanded respect. A careless step could still lead to cold water, soaked clothing, or illness. Daily life adjusted quietly. Doors were opened more often, yet never left open. Fires burned lower but remained central. Winter was not dismissed, it was carefully set aside. Snow had shaped posture and habit for months, And these habits did not vanish quickly. Shoulders stayed slightly hunched. Hands stayed close to warmth even when warmth was no longer urgent. Outside, the ground softened unevenly. Mud replaced ice. Movement became slow again, not from cold, but from uncertainty. Frozen ground had been firm. Thawing ground was not. People missed the simplicity of snow in this way. Snow had flattened the world. Thaw revealed its roughness. Water ran everywhere. Paths became channels. Fields held puddles. Snow melted into memory and moisture, leaving behind the weight of months. Animals moved cautiously. Livestock stepped carefully, unfamiliar with the softness underfoot. Birds returned tentatively, as if unsure whether winter might reclaim the day. Children noticed the return of color. Brown earth, dark bark, dull green hidden beneath debris. These colors felt almost loud after months of white and gray. Still, no one rushed forward. In the 1500s, people had learned not to trust sudden change. Winters sometimes returned sharply after thaw. Snow could fall again without warning, covering exposed ground overnight. And sometimes it did. A late snowfall did not shock anyone. It was accepted quietly. People adjusted clothing, tended fires a little more closely, and continued. Complaints were rare. Surprise had long been exhausted. Snow, even at the end of winter, maintained authority. As weeks passed, the ground slowly dried. Snow disappeared from thought as well as sight. It no longer framed each decision. Yet its influence remained in habits and caution. Work resumed gradually. Tools were carried outside. Fields were inspected, not yet worked. Life expanded outward inch by inch. Snow had narrowed the world. Thaw widened it. People spoke more. Voices carried farther. Sounds returned. Footsteps, tools, animals, wind moving through uncovered branches. Still, the memory of silence lingered. Snow had taught people how to live quietly, how to endure without urgency, how to accept repetition. These lessons stayed long after winter ended. When elders spoke of past years, they measured time in winters. The winter of deep snow. The winter that stayed. The winter that took too much. Snow marked life more clearly than summer ever could. And when the next winter came, and it always did, no one was unprepared in thought, even if supplies fell short. Snow was expected. Winter was understood. In the 1500s, snow was not an interruption of life. It was part of its structure. It shaped homes. It shaped movement. It revealed what mattered. And under its weight, people learned steadiness. Quietly. Persistently. Without spectacle. As spring finally began to settle into the land, the absence of snow felt almost unfamiliar. The ground looked uneven without its white cover. People noticed details that had been hidden for months. Stones, ruts, broken branches, forgotten tools. The world appeared rougher, less forgiving. Snow had softened everything by concealment. Its disappearance revealed reality again. People adjusted slowly. Bodies that had grown used to cold now felt exposed. Even mild air seemed sharp. Clothing layers were removed carefully, one at a time, never all at once. Winter habits loosened reluctantly. Life resumed outdoors, but not with energy. Movements remained cautious. Winter had taught restraint too deeply to be forgotten in a few warm days. Snow, now gone from sight, remained present in thought. Every cloud was watched. Every drop of cold rain was measured. People remembered how quickly snow could return. Fields were still quiet. Earth needed time. Snowmelt had soaked the ground deeply, leaving it heavy and slow to respond. Farmers waited. Impatience could ruin a season. In villages, paths slowly reformed. Mud dried. Stones were repositioned. The marks left by winter were repaired without discussion. Everyone knew what needed to be done. Snow had left its signature on structures as well. Roofs sagged slightly. Wood showed cracks. Stone held moisture. Winter was visible everywhere, even in its absence. Children spent more time outside now, though still watched closely. The memory of cold lingered in adults more than in the young. Children moved forward more easily. Sounds returned unevenly. Tools striking stone. Animals calling. Human voices carried farther again. The world felt louder, but not suddenly alive. People spoke more, but not excessively. Winter had refined communication. Words were still chosen carefully. Snow had shaped patience into routine. Even in warmth, life did not rush. In the evenings, fires were still lit, though less urgently. Smoke rose more freely now. Windows were opened longer. The inside world began to reconnect with the outside. Snow had divided them for months. Now they reunited slowly. Stories of the winter were told without embellishment. Not as hardship tales, but as records. The snow stayed late. The roof held. The fire lasted. These were measures of success. Snow had been a judge, not an enemy. When people looked back on the season, they did not describe it emotionally. They described it accurately. Snow depth. Duration. Cold. Survival. In the 1500s, that accuracy mattered more than expression. Summer would come. Work would return. Fields would fill. But winter would remain the standard by which all else was measured. Snow had proven what could be endured. And when future generations listened to these stories, they would not imagine beauty first. They would imagine quiet. White ground. Low skies. Slow days. Steady lives. Snow as it truly was. Not a moment. Not a memory. But a season lived through fully. As the year moved forward, traces of winter remained quietly present in daily habits. Even when the air warmed, people still checked the sky more often than necessary. Snow had taught them to observe before acting. The land slowly accepted its new state. Fields dried unevenly. Some areas welcomed work sooner, others resisted longer. Snowmelt had settled deep into the soil, and the earth responded in its own time. People did not argue with this pace. The winter of the 1500s had already shown them the cost of impatience. Footpaths became clearer each day. What had once been a continuous white surface now separated again into roads, yards, and fields. Boundaries returned, though they felt newly defined, as if redrawn after months of erasure. Snow had hidden differences. Its absence revealed them. Homes carried subtle reminders of cold months. Wooden doors bore marks from swelling and shrinking. Stone floors stayed cool long after the snow vanished. The memory of winter lingered in the structure itself. People slept differently now. Windows were opened slightly. Blankets were adjusted. Bodies relearned comfort. Still, no one forgot how fragile warmth could be. Snow had altered how people thought about preparation. Supplies were measured more carefully. Storage was reviewed. What had lasted, what had failed, what would be done differently next winter. All of this was considered quietly. Winter reflection did not require conversation. It lived in action. Animals returned fully to the open air. Their movements felt louder after months of quiet. The sound of hooves, wings, and calls reintroduced rhythm to the day. Children played longer outside now. Their laughter carried across yards that had once been silent under snow. Even so, adults watched the weather closely, unwilling to trust it completely. Snow had ended, but winter's discipline remained. Markets grew busier again. Goods returned slowly. Travel resumed carefully. Roads that had been softened by thaw needed time to recover. Journeys were planned with awareness, not excitement. Snow had narrowed the world. Now it expanded cautiously. Evenings lengthened. Light stayed longer. Fires burned less fiercely, yet they were never neglected. Winter had made fire central, and that lesson stayed. People spoke of the past winter, without exaggeration. Not as a story to impress, but as an experience to remember. The snow stayed long. The cold held. We endured. That was enough. In the 1500s, endurance did not seek praise. Snow had tested patience, discipline, and quiet strength. It had shaped the rhythm of life not through drama, but through persistence. And when years later people recalled that winter, they did not describe individual days. They described the feeling of living within it. Slow mornings, muted sounds, measured steps, shared warmth. Snow was not a single memory. It was a season that shaped everything around it. And when the next winter arrived, as it always did, people met it with the same quiet readiness. Fires prepared, stores checked, expectations lowered, because snow was never unexpected. It was part of life, part of time, part of survival. And in the 1500s, that understanding mattered more than comfort. As time moved further away from winter, the memory of snow settled into habit rather than thought. People no longer spoke of it daily, yet their actions still carried its influence. Winter had passed, but it had not been forgotten. The land slowly regained its voice. Wind moved more freely across uncovered ground. Water no longer hid beneath ice, but flowed openly in narrow streams. The sound of movement returned, though it felt unfamiliar after months of quiet. People listened carefully. Sound, once muted by snow, now arrived suddenly and clearly. A dropped tool echoed sharply. Footsteps felt louder than before. The world seemed less forgiving of noise. Snow had taught restraint even in speech. Work resumed with caution. Tools were used gently at first. Muscles remembered cold stiffness and did not yet trust full effort. Fields were approached respectfully, not as resources to be taken, but as spaces recovering from winter. Snow had demanded patience, and patience remained. In the evenings, people sat closer to open doors and windows. Fresh air replaced the heavy stillness of winter rooms. Smoke thinned. Light shifted slowly across walls that had been dim for so long. Yet even in warmth, fires were kept ready. Winter had made them symbols of safety, not just necessity. Snow had shaped memory in quiet ways. People remembered how silence felt, how days stretched, how little was needed to endure. These memories did not fade quickly. Children, who adapted fastest, moved forward easily. Adults carried winter longer, their movements still careful, their expectations still modest. Snow had taught them that ease was temporary. As seasons continued, winter stories softened. Details blurred. Hardship lost its edge. But the feeling of steadiness remained. When elders spoke, they did not describe suffering. They described persistence. Snow had not been dramatic, it had been constant. And constancy shaped character. The cycle continued as it always had. Warmth followed cold. Growth followed stillness. But winter remained the reference point. Snow marked the measure of a year. In the 1500s, people did not romanticize seasons. They lived inside them. Snow was not admired from distance, it was known intimately. It shaped homes, bodies, thought, and time itself. And when it returned again, quietly, inevitably, people would meet it the same way they always had. With preparation. With patience. With silence. Not because they lacked emotion, but because they understood winter did not require words. It required endurance. And that endurance had carried them through snow, through silence, and through time itself. As the memory of snow settled deeper into the year, it became less a subject and more a quiet influence. People no longer compared days to winter, yet the lessons of cold remained present in every routine. The land, now free of snow, carried signs of what had passed. Grass grew unevenly where drifts had lingered longest. Soil remained darker in shaded places. Winter had shaped growth just as it had shaped stillness. People worked steadily, without urgency. Winter had taught them that effort could not be forced. Fields responded only when ready. Tools were used with care, not haste. Snow had slowed the rhythm of life, and that rhythm did not suddenly disappear. Homes felt larger now. Windows stayed open longer. Light reached deeper into rooms that had been dim for months. Yet the memory of enclosed winter nights lingered, meaning people still gathered closer than necessary. Sound returned gradually. Voices carried across open spaces again. Yet no one raised their voice without reason. Snow had softened speech permanently. In the evenings, people sat quietly even when daylight lasted longer. The habit of silence remained comfortable. Conversation flowed only when needed. Snow had removed excess from life. What returned did so carefully. Children played freely now, but their games were calmer than before. Winter had taught boundaries. Cold had taught awareness. Adults noticed that food tasted different when eaten without urgency. Hunger had once been constant, now it was memory. That memory made meals quieter, more deliberate. Snow revealed what mattered by taking everything else away. As seasons turned fully, the year filled again with work, movement, and sound. Yet winter remained the measure against which all effort was judged. If something could be endured in snow, it could be endured anywhere. When people spoke of strength, they did not speak of bravery. They spoke of surviving winter without complaint. Snow had taught humility. Nature did not negotiate. It simply arrived and remained. Years later, people would recall those winters without detail. They would remember the feeling more than the facts. The weight of silence. The slow passing of days. The shared endurance. Snow shaped time differently. Days stretched. Nights deepened. Life narrowed and focused. That narrowing had value. In the 1500s, people did not seek comfort as a right. They accepted hardship as part of living. Snow made this understanding unavoidable. And when winter returned again, and it always returned, people met it not with fear, but with readiness. Fires prepared. Stores checked. Expectations adjusted. Snow was never a surprise. It was a season. A teacher. A constant. And life continued within it. Quietly, steadily, without spectacle.